What? You need the Wi-Fi, or are you good? Oh, I'm good.
We're gonna have everything easy. We're the one green. Look at the color coordination. I'm just really.
Everybody ready to go? Ready to go? Good evening. Welcome to the joint City Commission, County Commission meeting for this evening. We welcome everybody that is here as well as on Zoom. We're going to start out by having Sherry say a few words.
Thank you, Mayor, and good evening, everyone. If you are attending this meeting via Zoom, please ensure you are muted and your video is off if you are not actively participating in the meeting. This allows the active meeting participants to be seen on screen. If you have any trouble, you can send a chat, and all chats go directly to the meeting host. The city reserves the right to mute or turn individual videos off to minimize distractions during the meeting. This meeting is being recorded and broadcast on the city's YouTube channel and cable channel 25. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you very much. Start out with a couple of words from Chair Kelly as well as myself. I don't have a lot to say other than, again, welcome. Sarah, thank you for coming tonight, and Craig, staff, for everybody to be here tonight. This is obviously a very collaborative topic that we have here. I believe it's been about a year and a half that we had the agreement finished up that had been done, and it was the first time in a long time we had redone that agreement. So we're into it, and we've had a chance to see how it works, and now is a good time to kind of revisit what is going on with our fire department and get an update and have a discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor Larsen, and on behalf of the county, we're very happy to be here. Thanks for hosting. This is a collaborative process that we share, the way that we're structured, and we've made a lot of progress in the past couple of years on how we work together on this, so it's really great for us to be all in one space hearing the same presentation from LDCFM, and I look forward to the discussion and conversation.
Thank you. So we'll start with our chief, Llewellyn.
Making sure that the slides are working all right. Does that look good? Okay, they're up there. Good evening, Mayor Larsen and Chairperson Kelly and members of both commissions. We appreciate the opportunity to come and speak before this joint meeting of the City and County Commissions. My name is Rich Llewellyn. I'm the Fire Chief for Lawrence Douglas County Fire Medical, and I have with me Division Chief of EMS, Kevin Joels, and Senior Data Analyst, Mackenzie Azell. We're happy to have this opportunity to give you this presentation. We were talking earlier today. The last time we were all here in front of the City Commission was just a couple months ago. Each of us received notification from our Apple Watches the next day that said your pulse appeared to be above 120. Well, you didn't appear to be exercising. Are you okay? We think we're okay, and we hope we get a similar thought tomorrow. So. We did want to update you on where we're at with LDCFM historically and currently, and provide you with some opportunities to discuss what the future direction of our organization should be, and to look at a couple different angles that have been vetted by our team and provided to you for your review and discussion. First off, I want to talk about a new look for our logo in recognition of our collaborative agreement, our joint agreement. We do have a new look to our logo. You see that instead of Douglas County being in smaller font, it's now in the same size font on the bottom there, and we removed the hydrant and what's called the scramble from each side, and so fire medical is still included as well. But you'll start seeing this on new apparatus that show up. You'll see it on uniforms as they're phased in. So it does, I think, better represent our collaboration and the teamwork that we have here between the City of Lawrence and Douglas County. Just for some historical background, we do have 5 fire and EMS stations in the City of Lawrence, and they're noted on your map with the Maltese cross symbols, 1 through 5. And we do have 2 EMS-only stations. One is Station 11 in Baldwin City. The other is Station 12, what we call Station 12 in Eudora. That's co-located at the Eudora Fire Station. We have an ambulance there, a medic unit at Eudora Fire Station, and we have another medic unit down in Baldwin City that serves that part of the county. This has been our configuration in terms of fire stations within the city of Lawrence since 2006. In that year, we expanded to 5 stations. We added a Station 5 at 1900 Stewart, kind of 19th and Iowa, and we moved Station 4 over to Wakarusa from its previous location on Lawrence. The station in Eudora, or the ambulance being stationed in Eudora, occurred in 2012, so that was kind of the last little expansion that we had. If you look at the right side of your screen, you do see what we call our planning zones. This is how we view our response areas. They're roughly based on the closest apparatus to come into that area. Within the city of Lawrence, you'll see we have 5 urban planning zones, what we refer to as urban planning zones, 1 through 5. Those are associated with the stations. We have a planning zone in Baldwin City and then Eudora that are also, we talk about urban planning zones because those are urbanized areas under our system. We do have rural areas that we call Douglas County 1 through 5, or DG 1 through 5. DG 1 incorporates Grant Township. These are roughly based on the closest resource that could get there and what station it's associated with. So you see down in the southern part of Douglas County, we have Planning Zone 11 that's associated with Medic 11 coming out of Baldwin City. Looking at our total incident counts, this is the work that we do. This is the work that the folks who staff our apparatus are out doing every day. These are the EMS responses. These are the fire responses, the hazardous materials responses that we run on. You'll see at the time of our last expansion in 2006, we were running just shy of 9,000 calls at about 8964. With our last, got to move this over just a little bit. Our last data set came from 2022, and we're about 15,500. So quite a bit of increasing volume over the time period without any additional resources. The trend line has been continuously up. You see a little bit of a dip in 2019, and again a bigger dip in 2020. The dip in 2020 is an experience that most fire departments saw across the country associated with COVID, and I equated it to people not wanting to go to the hospital because of the fear of COVID and the unknown. So that's not an unusual dip. Also not unusual in my experience was the rebound the next year in 2021. The numbers came right back up to the trend line. Previous employers that I worked with saw similar increases. I think that's pretty common across the United States. We want to look at our heat maps and understand what our call dispersion is. These come from our run data from 2017 through 2021 throughout Douglas County and the city of Lawrence. You'll see some of the areas that are marked in dark red are where we're hitting over 1,500 calls a year. To note there, one grid that was altered intentionally was the grid that has Lawrence Memorial Hospital. We run a significant number of transports or transfers from that facility, and we didn't want to skew the data. So you'll see where the hospital's at. It just has the response data not associated with that address. And then to the right, you can see what our response times look like over those that same time frame. We want to meet within the city of Lawrence a 4-minute drive time response. We have turnout time criteria, but you can see where we're starting to struggle a bit on the periphery in meeting our response time expectations, particularly on the north area of Lawrence, the northwest, and the far south of Lawrence. Looking at some road mile mapping, we wanted to look at 2006 and compare it to 2023. We thought this might be worthwhile, particularly in the context of our ISO, or Insurance Service Office review, which looks at our disposition or our deployment. the ISO looks to make sure that we have engine response within a 1.5 road mile area for all the areas, and then ladder response within 2.5 road miles of all the areas. So you see in 2006, we had a pretty good coverage of most areas of the city. Again, some areas in the west and the far north did not have the 1.5 for engine coverage or the 2.5 mile for ladder coverage. I wasn't here in 2006, but my understanding is those areas weren't as developed at that point, and though they were in the city, they hadn't seen the development that we have seen. If you fast forward to 2023, we've put the current footprint of the city in those areas, and we also maintained our roadmap at a mile and a mile and a half, or excuse me, a mile and a half and 2.5 miles for engine and ladders respectively. You may see some of the roads look like there's more reach in those areas. We have more roads available. We're not driving faster, but we just have more roads in those areas. You can see, particularly in the far west and northwest, that there's more areas of blank places where we can't get to, or we don't have that 1.5 mile road coverage. Another thing we want to look at as we talk about activity is travel time analysis. We expect a 4 mile drive time from our stations. That's the benchmark that we have set. You can see that we're starting to develop areas in the north and the west where we don't have a 4-minute drive time, and as well in the far south where we don't have that drive time. And we don't encourage our members to drive irresponsibly. We want them to drive safely. So drive time is very important for us. On the right, you can see we played with the numbers a little bit to look at what a 10-minute drive time and an 8-minute drive time looked at from our current stations, our current station configuration, just with Lawrence stations, not looking at stations from outside of Lawrence.
Hello. All right. So from the 2020 station optimization analysis, we identified these 3 major gap areas. And these major gap areas we found where our standards of cover, that 4-minute drive time that Chief talked about, we were not able to reach those areas. So looking at these 3 maps, we can see the city of Lawrence. We have the northwest, the north, and the south gaps that are from the station optimization analysis. The green area is that standards of cover, so the 4-minute drive times from our current station locations. In the green area, we should see blue dots. So in the graphic, blue dots represent an incident that we are able to meet our travel time of 4 minutes or less. The red correlate to an incident that we were unable to meet that benchmark. So we do see some blues in the area that's not covered by green. We have units that are out and about. Maybe they're coming from another call. Maybe they're coming from training. They're not responding from their station, so they were able to get to those other incidents in a quicker time frame. We also see that there are red dots in green areas. So same thing, they might be responding from another incident or from training, or it might be another unit that's not responding typically in that first due area. So for example, on the south side, Station 5 typically responds to that area. It's our planning zone 5. If Station 5 is on a call in another area, another station will have to come into that space to respond to that incident. So that's what we can kind of tie into some of the response performance there.
To put a little bit of this in perspective, we'll just take an example out of one of the calls that happened earlier this year out at Rock Chalk Park. Fortunately, for most of the special events that are out there that take place during business hours or special event planned business hours, we're covered because we are paid to be there on an extra in an extra arrangement. But there are hundreds of residents that live out that way that aren't covered in that particular manner because they're not paying extra for us to be there for a special event. So we had a cardiac arrest that was out there earlier this year at the recreation center that fortunately they did have staff on site that was able to deploy an AED and have a successful return to spontaneous circulation, and the patient was able to recover. However, that was during business hours with employees that were trained how to use that AED. The building was open and they had access to that AED. Normal out of business hours, or if the facilities are closed, they wouldn't have that extra, the bystanders to be able to provide that care, and they're outside of that 4-minute drive time.
We also are seeing a correlation with these gaps to one of the appendix items that was in the presentation that we provided you. You can see the building permits have trending areas. It was just for a certain time period that was provided, but we have seen correlation with that. So why are we here? We are here to discuss two expansion stations and one relocation station that's being proposed by LDCFM. This is through the station optimization analysis. The map on your right shows scenario 5 that was presented through that analysis. However, that is not the exact scenario that we are proposing today, specifically talking about the locations of those stars. So if you look at the map, you can see stations 1, 2, 4, and 5. In the proposal, Station 3 is being relocated, and I'll let Chief talk about Station 3 here in a moment, or Chief Joels. And then we have 2 proposed expansion stations, one to address the west gap and one to address the south gap if Station 3 moves more towards the central north area. So with this, looking at the map, you can see candidate locations. So with the study, we use candidate locations using a GIS tool with 5 dimensions of risk, and basically ask the tool, given the data sets, what would be the smartest move to put stations. So Station 3 for this specific thing was selected to move, and then added those 2 stations. You can also see the 4-minute drive time, that same blanket of coverage from those other maps is here. And you can see in the dark green the coverage that's gained, and then the coverage that's lost in the blue. So this also used current city limits from 2019, and then the 2040 city limits projection also from that same time. So moving forward, our proposal does factor in that the data would be updated with 3 years of newer data, and also look at the new city limits and those other risk factors. Also included in that would be property locations, and that was not utilized during this optimization analysis.
All right, so we can discuss the policy questions. So there's 3 options here to discuss tonight. Option 1 is LDCFM expansion of 2 stations with a single relocation being recommended for Station 3 with a one-time cost of $52 million. Ongoing annual cost of $6.8 million. You can see the breakouts there. City of Lawrence on the one-time cost is $34.4 million. Douglas County is $18.1. City of Lawrence on the ongoing annual cost would be $4.4, and Douglas County would be $2.4 million. Option 2 is a one-time cost of $15.5 million, which City of Lawrence's breakout would be $9.9, and Douglas County's would be $5.5. And option 3 should be, should LDCFM's expansion go on the ballot in November, which, if that was to take place, we would have to consider education campaign, staff time in order to create that to be able to go to the ballot. City Commission would have to pass a resolution, a public meeting of submitting a ballot language to the county clerk. Ballot language would have to be received by the county clerk no later than September 1st.
Would like to add in as we talk about the potential for station expansion or relocation, and in light of the increasing call volume that we saw earlier, these stations are not only going to be absorbing some of those calls, but they're creating a layer of redundancy that we don't have currently. If Station 5 is out of its district, the next closest station may be Station 4 or Station 3, and they may be coming down to help out in Station 5 if there's an additional call there. So you can see the potential cascading effect as units move around the city. By increasing the number of available units, we increase redundancy. And this just doesn't occur within the city of Lawrence. We have what we call move-up alarms, where we may pull resources, the ambulances that are parked in Eudora or in Baldwin City, and they may move up in here to Lawrence to assist with busy periods. So we do have that in your appendix material. You can see how many times over the past 3 years what we call move-up alarms occurred. So that's an additional factor to consider as we're talking about that. We are talking, one of the things we have as far as an option is the potential for a one-time relocation, and that would most likely be Station 3. Station 3 was built in 1966. It's approaching its 60th anniversary, which is old for a fire station, barring a major renovation. Station 1 is older, but it did have fairly significant renovation that lasted for at least a couple years. The last major work on Station 3, which is up on 6th, just west of Castle, occurred in 2004. So it's 20 years past its last major renovation, and it's approaching its 60th birthday. So just some more factors to consider there.
So just to give you a picture, we did shoot a little high on some of these prices, and it's not for a wow factor. It's not to make your heart rate go high on your watch either. But we just wanted to be realistic with the local agencies that we've been able to find that have built recently, are building, or going to build very soon. Finding that, and I'll just give you an example on the Olathe shot there. It says $14 million. They built a station that was their Station 8 2 years ago. They moved into it, and it was $8 million. But their estimated Station 12 is now going to be between 12 and 14, and it's the same identical station, just obviously a different location. So there are rates that just have incurred over time because of the supply chain, most likely. So we just wanted to shoot high, just not to make anybody really panic. There are opportunities to have consolidated resources, maybe some partnerships with other county and city agencies to be able to co-locate. But here's just a few that are local that you can take a look at, and we could definitely have more conversations about design and purpose going forward.
So the last slide is what's next, and we think it's time to revisit the 2020 station optimization analysis just to make sure that the data is current and the locations or stations that we've identified are the correct ones based on current and future expectations. The city is considering the LEED standard or LEED certification for building, and that would come into play in terms of building a new station or planning for a new station. And then the potential impact for the cost share agreement, there was a percentage change that we noticed from where we're at in the current agreement that would occur or probably need to occur based on the change in department size. So that is it for our slides, and we're ready to answer any questions or watch your discussion as you wish.
I'm sure we'll have some questions, so don't go far. But thank you very much for the presentation, and we'll open it up to questions from the commissioners.
So, Chief, if in option number 2, when it's just moving Station 3, what locations are looked at for that, and then what gaps are remaining? Because we didn't get a map for that option.
Yeah, I think if that was the only option, likely Station 3 would remain relatively close to where it's at, maybe push out a little bit west. If we only had one station, we'd have to optimize where we were going to move it. But I think for it just being a standalone station, it's in a relatively reasonable location.
I'll have a lot of questions, so I will only ask a couple now and then let everybody else come in. How often are outside resources called in? You talked about Move Up, where you're using our own medic units within the county, but how often are we requiring resources from outside of the county? Do we have agreements for those? And what is the cost associated with it?
Yeah, great question. We're currently working on developing more robust agreements with outside agencies. When I arrived, the only mutual aid agreements were with Olathe, Overland Park, and Ottawa. Those were the existing fire service agency agreements. We do have a tender agreement in place where we can get tenders, particularly in Grant Township. But beyond that, we don't have really robust agreements with outside agencies. So we're working on that. I just got an agreement back for Shawnee Heights from City Legal and shipped it over to Shawnee Heights as kind of a first test case for a modern framework for a mutual aid agreement. And I've had discussions with a lot of other agencies around here. I don't necessarily want to name them right now, just so they don't get questions from their governance, but we are in talks with a lot of different agencies.
Okay, one last one, and then I'll stop. In terms of ISO ratings, so Lawrence is currently rated number 1. Is that right?
We are, yes.
And assume if we don't continue to build stations or mind our response times, at what point do we lose that designation and become a ISO 2?
Yeah, great question. In 2016, when we went to an ISO 1, we had about 99 points out of 105 and a half, I think is the not so round number. With our recent re-rate, we were just over 90 points, between 90 and 91. One of the areas where we lost points was in that deployment analysis, and that's looking at the 1.5 mile for engine or 2.5 mile, 2.5 mile availability for ladders, and if they can cover the built-up areas of the city. And so that is an area that concerns us, and I think our plan here would address it, or our station optimization plan that we had talked about.
I don't know if everyone is kind of up to speed on the ISO ratings and what they do to people's insurance rates. So, but that's kind of the trade-off, is we spend money to build stations, or individual homeowners and renters are burdened with the cost of additional insurance expense. Do you just want to cover that a little bit?
Yeah, thank you. ISO is the private organization that analyzes the fire protection that's available in the community. They come into the community, they look at dispatch systems, they look at water supply, and they look at the capability of the fire department to suppress fires that might start. Really the fire department is the area that we control as LDCFM. Other areas we work very closely with our cooperating agencies, both in Douglas County and in the city of Lawrence. And when insurance companies look to set fire protection rates for properties within a community, they look at that property protection class. So ISO 1 is the best property protection class you can have. It runs up through ISO 10, which doesn't have any fire protection. We're very proud of our ISO 1 rating. There are very few communities in the country that are able to maintain that. And in alignment with our accreditation, even fewer are both ISO 1 and accredited agencies. So we're very excited about the ISO class that we have. We think that the biggest impact is on commercial and industrial properties. If an industrial property is able to prove that they have an ISO 1, they get significant savings on their insurance. I couldn't quote numbers. I think that's a pretty privately held or closely held number, but I do know that that's where a lot of the difference is in industrial and commercial.
Thank you.
Other questions?
I'll just jump in, Commissioner Littlejohn. What if we were to pursue building out a couple more stations in the relocation? What would be the construction time of that? How long would it take for them to be completed?
So we've actually included this in our CIP proposal, so capital improvement projects. We've started it with 2024, this next year. And so for that, we have design and land acquisition in the same year, so 2024. At that time, just because of lead times for apparatus, so a medic unit and fire truck, we would also be looking to purchase those, or looking to start the procurement in 2024, build in 2025 for the first station. And then I believe Station 7 and Station 3 in our proposal and the CIP is that next year it kind of offsets a little bit.
Okay. And I had another question. I was just kind of curious and just like looking around the region in terms of population size and other cities around us that have stations. Seems like we're kind of in that middle zone where like cities below us in population have about the same amount of stations we do, but cities in comparative population or a little bit above us have like 7 or 8. I was just wondering if that was contributing to your analysis when you were going ahead and putting this together.
Yes, it did. We actually just had this conversation earlier. So when we did the 2020 station optimization analysis, we realized that we had 5 stations in the city of Lawrence, and then 1 in Baldwin and 1 in Eudora. And so we looked at what's the immediate need. And when we presented that station optimization analysis, we did say that our response times are not meeting benchmarks right now. So the immediate need is very much immediate. But then we were also talking about when we're running the updated data, we're hoping to see that these 3 stations hit those gap areas, or the ones basically help with that standards of cover. But then also looking into the future, understanding that if city limits are projected to change in 2030 and 2040, how that might change. Because I'm pretty sure after we published the 2020 station optimization analysis, there were some changes in the 2030 and 2040 plan. So understanding that and not wanting to put two stations in locations that would contradict with potentially another station looking forward. But yeah, we didn't want to necessarily jump the gun on it, and wanted to think about in the next 5 years what's reasonable for department growth.
Thank you.
I can add a little bit in, if I could, Commissioner Littlejohn, on your question. I've worked in a couple different communities. The community I was at just prior to moving here was about 110,000 people, but a smaller and more compact and more densely populated community. It had 6 fire stations, multiple units at each fire station, and a few more units in service just based on the activity and run volume. Another community I worked at prior to that one has about 135,000 in population, but much more dispersed in terms of density, about 75 square miles, and they're working on their 11th fire station. So it's both a factor of population density and also geographic shape.
Thank you.
Another reason for density.
Mayor.
Commissioner?
And then after this, I'll remind you of Commissioner Sellers. In your appendix, you have the call type distribution, and I know you're prepared for this question, and I'm sure we've all been asked this by members of the public, but it does seem to show that a goodly number of your calls are more for EMS. So talk to us about how you did or didn't consider making smaller ambulance stations in different locations versus creating a larger station or larger stations.
Sure. So we did consider that. We are all hazards fire department. We work out of our ambulances just the same. We're cross-trained for both fire and EMS. It makes a little more sense for us to continue to do that. And then with the gap analysis that's pretty apparent on those 3 sections of the city, including some of the county, it just makes sense to keep those all hazards deployments together. Did that answer you? Or? Yeah.
Also, we looked at our response time capabilities for both EMS and fire. Well, we actually looked at hazmat, tech rescue, EMS, and fire, and saw the same trends throughout all of those risk classifications, and then also the categories, so low risk and high risk, and maximum and moderate. So we saw the same trends of response capabilities. But yes, so you talk about the call type distribution, which is this one. And one thing that we also look at, noted in the call type examples, is fire calls, EMS calls, and other calls. So just like Chief Joel said, how we are all hazards department, and we might have a medic unit and a fire truck show up to a medic, an EMS call for the critical tasking needs. So if it's a higher risk medical call, we need more resources, and we're not just going to send multiple medic units when a medic unit and a fire truck can do the job.
Okay. Questions?
Commissioner Sellers.
Commissioner Sellers, do you have some questions?
I do. That's why my hand is up. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, Chief, and your team for presenting today. I do have a couple of questions, ping-ponging back and forth on a couple of items here. On the call type distribution, and it was kind of alluded to in the presentation, when there is an emergency and we need to deploy more resources, which then creates I don't want to say deficiency, but it limits the number of additional resources we may have for another call. So I guess my question is, have we had situations where, because of one particular type of emergency risk, created a deficiency in another need for another high need risk, and how did the team circumvent that, or what was the result of that, or can you kind of speak to that?
Yeah, I can speak to that using an example of a series of arson fires that we experienced in North Lawrence. I believe it was either late last year or early this year. We had a working fire in a light industrial building, meaning that all the resources there were engaged. We had additional fires that had occurred already. And I was responding from home, and another fire came in, a reported fire behind Johnny's Tavern. All of our resources were out. We did request help from our neighbors at Consolidated Fire District 1. We also had some resources coming from Johnson County to assist us. It was a lonely feeling to be pulling up at Johnny's in just my small fire SUV, because I don't have a lot to do. So luckily that fire had already been extinguished. It was in a dumpster. But we did have resources en route, but it does show that our system is built on redundancy, and it's important for us to have those in place. So the more access to resources we have, the more redundancy we have availability, and we're able to cover more types of incidents and more incidents at a single time.
Okay, thank you. And then again, another question. When we look at the different proposals, and if we look at the first option of the expansion stations and then the relocation, as far as FTEs, what are we looking at, and what does that number include any additional FTEs we need to assist with, I don't want to say issues, but current concerns we're having that I know the last time you spoke, we looked at, I know overtime was brought up, and we do have one of our KPIs looking at clock hours. And so I just want to know what additional how many FTEs will we bring on board with this? And I think we've had this discussion before, but then would that fill the gap as far as what we would need to take some of the pressure off of overtime that we're seeing with staff?
Yeah, so kind of a two-part answer. So for these stations, we are proposing 28 personnel for these two stations. Within that is a staffing relief ratio, and that takes a look at our overtime usage. It takes a look at basically how many employees do we need for each seat in an apparatus, whether that's a fire truck or a medic unit. And so we've done those calculations, and that is, it's addressing the station expansion. And then we're hoping to do more of that for our 2024 operating budget proposal, as far as the current stations that we have right now, using that same staffing relief factor.
Per new station.
28 per new station.
Per each, right?
Total. Yes, you're correct. 28 people per station.
Per
So
station.
for 3
Okay.
years. Yep. Thank
Okay.
you.
All right. I was going to be excited. I was like, 2 expansions and all we need is 28 new staff. I said, oh, don't tell Jeremy that too loud. Okay. On your slide 10, this is based on the agenda, the request/discussion topic. So when I'm looking at this with the scenario with the 2 expansion stations and the 1 relocation station in your I can't remember what in your key, you have with the dark green is the coverage gain. Is there any way, or did you overlap this to see how this I guess, did you take this and overlap it with any parts where we have agreed to some to land annexation to see if that's impacted by coverage gain? I know we wouldn't see this from here, and I can kind of eyeball it, but does land that we've recently annexed, how is it impacted by this station proposal location and with the gain coverage? Do we know that yet?
Yeah, Commissioner Sellers, it's pretty light, but there's a solid gray line that shows the current footprint of the city, including all of our recent annexations. I think with the exception of the annexations south of K10. And then there's also a more subtle dotted gray line that shows the anticipated 2040 city limits or growth area. So we do have green. We can see where the drive time, the 4-minute drive time, does cover those areas that have been annexed recently, and those areas that are anticipated to be annexed within the next 17 years.
Okay, so your dotted line that's proposed, that is projecting 2040, takes into account that piece that any land that we've annexed.
Correct.
Okay. And then
That's from the old 2040 plan, just FYI. And I do want to make a correction. Instead of 28, it's 24. So 24 per station.
24 per station.
Yep.
Okay.
Okay. And then last question. I know I've continuously brought this up, and I do it, one, as a reminder to my own self and my notes, but also to a reminder to each respective commission. Last summer, there was the Bob Bethel King Care Oversight Committee had several days of hearings as it related to EMS and how there is a gap in reimbursement rate, Medicaid reimbursement rate with EMS services. And several other conferees were not only just state EMS, but also some of our county EMS services that border the Oklahoma, that state border with Kansas Oklahoma border. And what they were saying is that because of the low Medicaid reimbursement rate, that they often see that they're losing staff across the border, across the state line, because of salaries and because of the gap in the rate that is currently being taken, as opposed to what opportunities there could be to increase that rate. And I know I previously asked this question to our past chief as well as interim chief, and it was kind of dismissed as, oh, well, this is a county thing, this really doesn't impact the city. But anything related to money, in my opinion, as it relates to money to be able to have additional funding for whether it's resources for equipment or for staffing or whatnot, it's both of our issues. So I know you're somewhat familiar with it. Where are we at with that piece? I know that it was presented in front of the legislature. Is this something that as bodies, elected bodies, we need to be advocating for the reimbursement rate to increase so that that's additional funding coming in, or where are we at with that? If you could share, anyone could share with me that, anything on that.
Yeah, sure. So we apologize that we didn't get you that information. We're actually currently working on that for you right now. Since the last presentation about a month and a half ago, we've been trying to get some of that data for you. It takes a little bit longer. Our billing supervisor has been working on that, as well as implementing a new software program into the city so that we can recoup some funds. So we apologize for the delay, but we will get you a better answer sooner than later. In regards to that, though, we have spent some time on the Hill as an EMS group, and we are seeing an increase in Medicare reimbursement. I believe it's going to be up to 100% is what they were talking about. Now, is it reimbursed to 100% of what we collect, or is it be what we bill? We don't know that yet. So we're still working on that. So I'd love to give you the full answer tonight. We will get you something shortly. It is on our project to get that for you. We apologize that you don't have that. But it is being discussed.
Okay.
It'd be great if as much noise as you can make about it on the Hill, then we would appreciate that. We can help coach you on some things to say. But I think you're pretty well versed in that. So if you have any specific other questions that we haven't been able to get to, we're more than happy to answer that for you.
Okay, thank you. I do appreciate that. It would be great to have that information. Like I said, I've been clamoring about it for the last year, and while I didn't appreciate it kind of being brushed aside, I allow being a freshman to an elected body. I checked it up to that, but now this is a matter of a process and opportunity for us. And I'd really like for us, I really want to make sure that we are capturing as many advantages as we can as it relates to recouping funds that could help in this capacity, whether it's funding for additional FTEs, for recruiting, whatever it is. That's missed opportunity funding for us, and I don't want to see that. I don't want us to leave money on the table if it's available to us. I'll yield if there's any additional questions at the time, Mayor. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? I've got two.
A couple.
Okay, I'll go ahead. You can go ahead.
So can you look at slide 19 in your appendix and help me understand it a little more?
Which,
That one there. Yeah, these charts here. So walk me through what I'm looking at and maybe I won't look so dumb.
Yeah, no, it's okay. So these maps are from our Community Risk Assessment Standards of Cover. They're also from our annual reports that we submit for accreditation. And so on the far left, we can see EMS high risk. So all of our call types, we give a category and a classification to. And then with each of those, we talk about distribution. So the very first, the first truck, or whether that's a fire truck or a medic unit to arrive on scene, and then also the effective response force, which is the ERF, and that's the full complement. So if we need X amount of trucks, they all get there by that time. So here we're looking at our first arriving unit. And so for high risk EMS calls from 2017 to 2021, we can see the response performance in these areas. And so this is the travel time. 4 minutes is the benchmark, so that's our goal. And then we can see through the colors what the percent benchmark was met for those incidents. So if we look at Planning Zone 5, we were talking about that earlier, that's Station 5 right in the middle of the city of Lawrence. We can see that there were 192 incidents, if I can read that correctly, and 76% of those incidents we met the benchmark. So we were able to get there in 4 minutes or less. If we look to the right, Planning Zone 2, we had 132 incidents and 84% of those high risk EMS calls, we had the first unit arrive there within the 4 minute travel time. Does that help with, there's that one.
Yeah.
And
that's
then
what I understood it to mean. So here's where my question comes from. If I look at Planning Zone 11 on the EMS high risk, it was a 57% meet, but you don't have a recommendation to do anything down in that area. Am I correct?
Correct. The station optimization analysis, we strictly looked at the urban areas. So on the left and on the right, we're looking at the urban areas, and the middle map is the rural areas. So Chief mentioned earlier that a big part of this request is to build that depth within our system so that Station 11 that typically responds to Planning Zone 11, if we pull them in to the city of Lawrence for a move up, that takes them out. So Station 5, Station 4, or Station 2 might be responding to those incidents in Planning Zone 11. So building that system to keep people in their stations able to respond to their area.
Okay, then my other two questions are, you say you're ISO 1, right? How many other communities in Kansas are ISO 1?
That's a good question. The majority of Johnson County, I can get you that number. We also have how many are accredited and ISO 1, and I want to say it's less than 10 in Kansas.
Okay. Yeah, I'd like that information. And then my last question to you, when you look at those maps that we looked at on slide 9, so this is the identified gap areas, I was really taken by how much red and blue is both in the 4 minute zone and outside of the 4 minute zone. That was really interesting to me. Did you do any analysis of, let's say it's 4 minutes and 30 seconds, so we can get some idea of if we don't make it, like what should the community expect if we don't? Did you do any of that type of analysis?
So we didn't. We currently used our identified benchmarks, but that has been something that I was actually asked in our accreditation hearing in Florida was who sets those benchmarks and what does the department do about that? The answer is the department doesn't set those. The authority having jurisdiction and community set them. So that is another question. If we want to look at our benchmarks, that is open all the time. So in the urban benchmark for travel time, that's where we're at 4 minutes.
So the 4-minute mark is not an accreditation mark. That's just something the local governing bodies have asked for. Is that what you're telling me?
So that's something that has been agreed to with the authority having jurisdiction to the governing bodies.
Yeah.
It's something that we have to have as far as benchmark goes for the accreditation process. The accreditation process does not tell us what it has to be. However, they will compare performance to say we're always wanting to improve. However, we've not moved ours for X amount of years. Also, ours have been adopted. We've adopted them from the NFPA 1710 standard. So industry best practice for urban areas is that 4 minutes for travel time.
Okay. Thanks.
Quick follow-up question. So that is Commissioner Reed. To piggyback off Commissioner Kelly's question, that helped understand sort of the source of the 4 minutes, but just theoretically, if you were to change that, is that what the ISO rating, is that part of what ISO rating is based on? Like, is that I guess an important factor, what that benchmark drive time is?
So our benchmark isn't looked at by ISO,
Okay.
our performance is.
Okay.
And so when ISO evaluates us, we submit performance to them.
Got it. Thank you.
Just to follow up real quick, I was just looking at that NFPA 1710 says it's a 4 minute is the ISO. Isn't that the ISO recommended time, the best practice, the 4 minutes? Am I looking at that wrong?
I believe ISO looks at deployment on travel or drive time,
Just
travel miles.
Travel mile.
And the NFPA 1710 is looking at travel time. So they're looking at a couple different items.
Got it.
Yeah, actually, but you covered my questions there, Patrick. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. I do have just one more, though, on slide number 6 of 20 on the emergency performance, incident dispersion, emergency performance on the right-hand map. I noticed that we had some red areas that seem to be really close to fire stations. Could you give me an idea as to what that would be about?
Yeah. If we look at, there's a red area that's somewhat close to Station 4. It's a couple boxes away from Station 4. There are not a lot of calls in that area. That's what's the lake that's down there? Lake Alvamar.
Okay.
Is fills a majority of that box. So if we have 1 or 2 calls in there and we didn't do a good job getting there, or we're coming from a distance away, our response time is going to show poorly in that area. So it's going to show that we did not have a good response time. If there's an area that is further away from the station that we're not getting to very often because of drive time, you're going to see kind of similar view. So if you look at far north Lawrence, where we're going to have some more calls, but it's a little bit further from a station, we have the same color as you see at that one that's close to Station 4.
Got it. Makes sense. Thank you. Any other questions, Commissioner Sellers or anybody?
Commissioner Kelly, I have a follow-up to that. So it's interesting to me that all of those areas in red are on the edges, and I guess that's where they would be less populated. And because of the small number, it may skew your response rate on your response times. As an educator, we don't look at classes that are super small because the number is too small. Do you ever push those out in your analysis and say, there's a certain threshold we got to get to before we look at whether we put a response rate on? Because I think what you're saying makes total sense. If you only have 2 places you're responding to, you'd be at 50%. But is there any, we call it an N factor, is there ever an N factor you're looking for there?
Yeah,
making sense?
There's quality and quantity if you want to look at it that way. And the quality is the number of times we're up there. The quantity, if you will, is population and growth in that area. And so those areas on the north and the west are areas where we're experiencing significant growth, and cross-referencing those, if we were to overlay that with the map that shows building permits, you'll see those areas have a lot of building permits in them. So we're getting both calls and response times that are lengthy because of the distance from station in those areas. And not all of them are like that. The other area that I could point out that's probably not very many calls, but also poor response time is the one at the far south of Lawrence. It's south of K10 there. Not very many calls in that area because there's not much there, but it does take us a long time to get there. So a kind of a similar effect, but the opposite is the kind of darker colored box on the far west side of Lawrence. That's similar color. There's going to be more calls there. It's just also very far for us to get to.
Thank you.
Too quick. Oh, go ahead.
For our data, we do have an outlier policy that we use to submit our accreditation data. So we can provide that to you as well. And that's something that we look at when we go through our response time and really break apart each of those time metrics. And that's something that would be used when we do the 2020 station optimization analysis update.
When we do that optimization, the update to the optimization, can you put in like the annexation, like the areas, like assume there's going to be X number of houses there? Can you do that?
Yep. So when we do the analysis, we work with the GIS team with the city. So we use the 5 identified dimensions of risk. And so we'll update each of those with the data that we have and then some forecasting as well. So there are some analysis that goes along with that. So a great example was we talked about the road mileage and being able to access certain points. To be able to look at an area and say, okay, the road goes this far, let's understand that there's probably going to be housing development. So even though the line shows that it stops here, that's because the road currently stops there. But understanding that if there's going to be a neighborhood, that it looks like it should be able to expand to that area. And that becomes a part of that response capability.
Well, I guess I'd be, in addition to what we've already approved, I'd be very interested on, I mean, most of these maps are looking at representing, 15th Street on the other side. I'd like to see what that looks like because in the next, few years that will be developed. If you could include that. My other question, you talked a little bit about the timeline for building out under one of your proposals. What would the staffing proposal look like? I'd assume it'd be very hard to hire 48 firefighters in a short amount of time. What's the ramp up on hiring firefighters?
If you say yes today, I'll start tomorrow. Unfortunately, this industry has seen a decline in wanting to apply. So we've been fortunate here in the city of Lawrence and Douglas County to hire great people, even though the applicants has been a little bit lower than in the past. It would take a significant ongoing recruitment process we would have to have class after class to be able to do that. We have limiting space.
Having the same, hopefully at the same time, but we'd have to start at different points of getting them in place. So we'd definitely be sitting down and trying to map that out ahead of time.
Commissioner.
Mayor,
A couple of
Larsen,
questions.
Okay.
excuse me.
Go ahead, Commissioner Sellers.
I can wait after Commissioner Wiley. I've waited this long, so.
So looking at the option 1 with the additional 2 stations and moving 1 station, how long would that format be expected to cover the needs before, as we're looking to grow west, before there would need to be looked at again? So it'd be nice to have not only if we're putting money into this, but what is also the next step after that. I know that's further into the guesswork part, but there are some suggestions for where development might occur later than that.
Yeah, we've been discussing that, and when we sit in our meetings and look at maps, we look at the growth and we kind of debate where we think growth is going to be, and we monitor the applications that come through the city. So I think the answer is we're not sure, but we can give you a best guess. The best guess that I would like to do would be based on both what I would anticipate happening on the southeast part of the city with growth due to the Panasonic plant coming in place, and also additional growth to the northwest. Just visually looking at a map and kind of putting dots on it, I could see, at some point in the future, another station further out to the west and north, perhaps, and then one maybe further to the south and east. So that's what I would anticipate. Well past my tenure here, but just looking forward.
And the other is, as we expand into rural areas, we get closer to stations that are already held by Consolidated One. I think especially the Wakarusa station, which is close to areas that are suggested for the moving of, or for an additional station. How does that play in terms of response?
We haven't had that conversation specifically with Consolidated Fire District 1, but we think there are opportunities here for collaboration with our builds, not only with other fire districts, but also with other entities. I've had just kind of shooting the breeze with Kansas Fire Rescue Training Institute. They're looking for space, and that's something that we may be able to collaborate with them. There's some potential for redundancies with some of the other emergency management functions in the area. And so there are opportunities for us to maximize the use of these facilities. I know internally we've had discussions about creating space to have wellness and physicals, annual physicals done, an examination room, if you will, or to visit with a mental health care provider and have those in spaces that are quiet but are owned and are maybe not next to administration. So remove some of that potential fear of seeing someone.
Can I follow up on that? Sorry, Commissioner Sellers. So when you mentioned co-location opportunities, was Wakarusa not one that you were considering? Only just in kind of chit chat, not in any terms of any long-term planning?
Pardon me, what was your?
Wakarusa. That's Consolidated One. Yeah, it's in the city limits. That wasn't one you considered for your co-location. Was your term co-location opportunities?
Yeah, it's something that we've that I've thought about. I haven't had a talk with Chief Baxter about that yet, but I have looked around his station and just considered that in my head. But we would want to have those formal discussions, maybe more than just over coffee.
Commissioner Sellers.
Just real quick in regards to the staffing piece, do we know of any state practices as far as recruitment strategies for additional trainees, any type of incentivization programs or something of that nature, kind of like a reciprocity or housing bonus in order to recruit public safety officers such as fire and medical?
Sure. So over the last couple of years, we've done a lateral move. We've incentivized by bringing lateral transfers over from folks that have experience and or certifications that would increase their pay, or we would give them a bonus. Specifically, paramedic is what we're giving a bonus for now. We are in conversations currently with the local as well as ourselves about what can we do to incentivize and have these lateral moves come over here so that it entices those folks to come here, live here, and work here for years to come. So we are investigating, and we've implemented some strategies within the last 2 years. One of them, if you are an EMT or an AEMT and you start with us, you will go to paramedic school and finish that within an allotted time. It's currently 3 years. We may have to adjust that just because of the ability to monetarily pay for that if we get a large group of people and or the way that paramedic schools play out. You don't always get to pick when they start, they pick for you. And so we would hate to put somebody into a predicament where they have to go to school earlier than they're comfortable with and then not do well because of the stress of starting a new at a new department. So we have discussed that. We've changed quite a bit in the last 24 months.
And then as a quick reminder with the CIP request, strategy-wise, are you thinking of, is this something more concurrent as the requests over the years? Are you thinking getting equipment ordered along with land acquisition and building design, or how do you envision rolling out the CIP?
Yeah, so in the CIP, a change that we've done this year that you'll see soon, that's different than last year, is that we are putting the land acquisition and design in the same year. We think with the current market that we're able to do that within a year, and then the build would be the next year. So equipment to go within those stations, and then also within the apparatus, we would look at the lead time for those, and some of that would be in our operating budget, because that's where we put some of our equipment. Others will go into the CIP proposals.
Okay.
Anything else, Commissioner Sellers?
I do, but in the interest of time, we can keep it going.
Yes, okay.
I know in terms of incident count, you had 2022, but do you have anything as of now? What's trending for 2023?
Yeah, we actually looked this morning. Right now, we are almost to 6,000 calls for 2023. We had looked at what the average call volume was per day since the beginning of the year and now, and we're right around 44 or 46 calls a day. 2 years ago, we were at 36 calls a day. So we are seeing a steady increase in that.
Okay, thank you.
Mayor, I have a question. This is Commissioner Reed. I am curious about, talk to me about North Lawrence a little bit. I've brought this up before. It might have been before your time, Chief Llewellyn. I don't think we've been in conversation about it, but you know, when well, there's a very tiny piece of red in the in North Lawrence, but it's not optimal otherwise. It's yellow and orange, and you know, North Lawrence is the odd neighborhood in that the only access point is the bridge. So I have long had conversations with residents over the years about concern about not having a station in North Lawrence. It's a relatively low population density. The city limits don't go too far beyond the bridge, right? And Grant Township is also its own unique sort of situation geographically. But I just want to understand what kind of conversations y'all have had about that, because the numbers don't look great. There's also more infill happening in North Lawrence than some other neighborhoods. So density is increasing there. And again, that access point. So I'm curious, I guess it's a twofold question. One, can you let us in on what does the plan look like if the bridge is inaccessible in terms of a geographically cut off neighborhood for any of your stations to respond to? And two, do you have any concerns or inklings about sort of increased demand for calls there over the years, and whether or not, you know, that north central station optimization, I'm not sure that that will have impact on North Lawrence, right? Because it's further removed than Station 1 is.
Yeah, so in recent years, really actually for years past, I shouldn't even say recent, we have staffed numerous events when that concern has been brought to our attention or we know about it. So we never take that lightly. We've always either put an ambulance or a fire truck up there during those heavily populated times, most recently during the St. Patrick's Day parade. So we do spend some time up there. There is obviously other access to North Lawrence via the highway, which is fortunately it's a highway, right? So we don't have any stoplights, and I'm not saying that it's not a concern and it would delay that time, but there is access either from Eudora getting on I-70 or the other two exits into Lawrence.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, with to be respectful of everybody's time, we'd indicated we'd go an hour. Does anybody want to continue with the conversation? Is anybody concerned about doing that? If not, do you mind if we ask more questions or have more discussion? Are you okay with that? Okay.
Are we Commissioner Mayor Larsen, are you setting a time, or are we just going to let this continue to go organically?
Well, that's kind of where we're getting at, is to how far we want to go, kind of trying to get there. So we could go another 10, 15 minutes. Let's go 15 minutes.
Okay. Do we need a motion, or are we just agreeing by acclamation?
No, we don't need a motion for that. Just that's what we're going to work at. 15 minutes. So it'll be about.
Mayor, if I could add in, since we're going to continue on, I just wanted to expand on Commissioner Reed's question about
Sure.
our discussion about North Lawrence. We haven't looked specifically at activity or trends relative to that area of the city, but we do have that conversation, as Chief Joel said. Anytime there's what I would call an artificial blockage to the bridge or a potential for concern for access, it would be similar to what would happen if there was some type of emergency that blocked the bridge permanently. But we do have those plans in place.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I, hopefully as part of your process of those working on those mutual aid agreements, that our neighbors to the north and northeast especially, I'm sure we've called on them a lot because of that geographic. They're just quite closer than we are at times, depending. So thanks.
Okay, other discussion? You want to look at the policy questions or?
I got one more thing to throw out.
Okay.
It came to my attention, I'm sure it's come to other commissioners' attention recently, that the University of Kansas doesn't necessarily pay taxes in the same way that we do. And they may have a considerable number of calls, although I haven't seen a specific number. I'm only hearing this anecdotally. Without creating more work for anyone, do you want to comment on whether or not we should reevaluate that relationship, since we're here with our strongest partners? That might be a conversation we should create somewhere else, but I wanted to mention here while we work together.
To speak to the first part of your question, I haven't seen data specific to our responses on university property. And I think the other question is probably a governance question.
The only data set that we've really seen an increase of call volume is relative to false alarms or smoke detectors going off in dormitories. So that is one thing that we're trying to work with those partners. The department is working with KU to try to figure out how do we stop those from happening, those false alarms, and really be sure that we're responding to emergencies.
I believe we started charging for those this year, didn't we?
That is on our plan. We had to turn over with our assigned assistant city attorney, and that's on our immediate ask for assistance with crafting an ordinance to bring before you.
Okay, I thought that was part of the 2023 budget, was to start collecting that. It is. Okay. Other items, other thoughts?
So I'm back on page 19, which are the response times in the rural area, the central map there. And so your other maps are counting first on scene, and then the other piece of data you have is when do you have a full complement. When talking about the rural area, first on scene is not LDCFM. So when the ambulance gets there is that full complement. So it's a little bit different data set between the two. And I think one of the things that Commissioner Kelly was kind of getting to is how do we better see and understand the data for first response and also for ambulance response within those geographic areas, because they're pretty chunky. There's a lot of data within there, I'm sure, but is there another way to visualize that so we can understand it better?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll answer that in two parts. All of these maps are the first responding unit, LDCFM unit. We have talked previously about looking at other agencies' data, and so we still need to set a time to do that and to identify what that response looks like. The other thing was some of our recommendations from the newly published documents related to accreditation, and also accreditation recommendation for the department, is to look at our planning zones in a different way. So Planning Zone 11 is a great example. Planning Zone 11 is massive. We can just see that whole space. It's 37 incidents and 57% met. But I could not tell you where in that area by looking at that planning zone those happened. So what we're wanting to do in the immediate future is look at our planning zones, reevaluate the planning zone sizes, and then also the correlation with stations, if that's something that we want to do with the correlation, or just be separate, or looking at different parts of risk in the community throughout Douglas County. And so part of the delay with that is we wanted to see what we were going to do with our deployment model to see if the planning zone makeup could revolve around that, or look at specific pieces of high risk areas and separate those off when looking at data sets like this.
And I know we're here to talk mostly about the response times in Lawrence as a good part of that, joint meeting here. So as we add more stations in Lawrence, my guess is that many areas of the rural area will also see an increased response time as we move stations further to the edges of town and get out of town more quickly. I think that southwest part of the county will continue to be unmet or undermet. And that's just, if we have the right data, that we can be watching for that and decide when we need to have that other discussion.
Yes, and I'd like to follow up with that. Hopefully have a decrease in response time.
Right. That's what you're.
But yeah, so that's what we're thinking. All of our LDCFM units can respond countywide. So our medic units that are located here in the city do not stay in the city. They can go out to other parts of the county as needed. So yeah, hopefully that's the plan with those station expansions. Specifically, when talking about Planning Zone 11, Station 6, that Southern Star would be where that station would be around, would primarily respond to that area as well.
Thank you.
Any other items? Commissioner Sellers?
Are we in the discussion phase or are we still asking
Yes,
questions?
discussion. If you've got questions, that's fine too. Discussion.
I don't have any questions. I think I was looking at the discussion item. I didn't know if we were going to get to those pieces. So I'll wait for those and like I have been, wait for those who are in the room to generate additional discussion on recommendations from LDCFM.
Okay. So we can move on to the policy questions that were proposed, options 1, 2, and 3. Any thoughts?
First off, I guess I'll get it started. I'd be in favor of option 1, just given what my questions and kind of where I've been leaning. It seems like we've been pressing pretty hard with the stations that we have. So especially if we've got further development with Panasonic and our recent annexations, that it would make sense to go ahead and keep trend with that. So.
Thoughts?
Do you want to expand upon why you're not interested in sending this to a ballot measure?
I don't believe, I don't know if it's worth the expense of doing it if we're going to have to do it anyway, when I feel we're going to have to do it anyway. So why wait to go ahead and do it by, and add staff hours to do it and probably add, other costs with putting it to a vote like that when eventually we're probably going to have to do it anyway fairly soon. So.
How do you see us paying for it?
I'm not at that point yet, but
Sure.
Yeah. I mean, that's
Yeah.
a fair question, but I just see the need. So that's my honest answer.
Okay, thanks.
Mayor, do we have anyone is Jeremy online?
He is.
So Jeremy, can you talk about the difference in incorporating this into a CIP, whether we went with option 1 or option 2, and cross-reference that with if we did a ballot measure, which could potentially mean an increase in sales tax? Or would that be the only option with a ballot measure?
Jeremy Wilmoth, Finance Director. I've not had a lot of conversations with the fire department about this, but the conversations I have been leaning more towards a mill levy than a sales tax.
Okay.
So I don't know if sales tax is an option. Mill levy is the discussions that we've had. So I guess the only distinction would be if this were to go to a ballot initiative, then we would, need to come up with what we believe the mill levy impact is.
Right.
I would recommend that we have some kind of a leading factor as well, so that we don't just fund the first year cost, but we have some way to fund ongoing cost for both the building projects and the operations. I believe it would be up to both the county, depending on who would be putting issues on the ballot, as to whether that's a property tax or a sales tax or some combination thereof.
Thank you, Jeremy. And so then with it being, if it's a ballot measure and we're looking at in initial conversations were a mill levy increase, that would automatically mean for this year, we would potentially go over the revenue neutral rate and we would have to proceed with those processes as well in preparation for if that was a decision made. I guess I'm trying to map this out with a ballot measure. How does that impact what we're going to agree upon for this year's budget and CIP?
That's a good question. I don't know that anything in this proposal would impact the 24 budget per se, as I believe we would simply be in the design phase. So the heavy cost for both the city and the county would come in I believe 25 and beyond. So if the elected officials were to choose the ballot measure route, we would get that on the ballot in September for a mill levy impact in the 2025 budget.
2025 budget.
Close question. Do we don't have any sales tax eligibility, do we? I mean, countywide, we're going to do a countywide sales tax, correct?
Correct. We don't have any countywide eligibility.
Okay. Yeah.
I think so.
It wouldn't be an option in the county. I guess my concern with a ballot issue is who does the ballot issue? Is it a county ballot issue and then the city follows up? If we put two ballot issues on, one for the city and one for the county, what happens if one passes and one fails? Or that's my concern about a property tax issue. And I guess the city property tax mill would be greater than the county's. But on the other hand, if we were only going to do one ballot measure, it seemed like it'd have to be the county to see what every resident in the county thinks about it. But they would be disproportionately affected more than the city. So that doesn't seem like a fair question. So that's my concern about ballot issues. How you would, since we're jointly funding these, how would you put that on a ballot?
We don't yet have the data for what impact it would have outside of the city of Lawrence in terms of EMS, which of course is the part that falls on the county. So that would be premature in terms of any kind of ballot measure that would go county-wide, because we can't make that claim yet.
Yeah. Again, I was being more hypothetical, like how would you do that?
Yeah.
Because the ballot measure, even for the county, once you figured it out, even if you wanted to, it would affect someone who lived outside the city limits of Lawrence differently than it would affect someone in the city of Lawrence. So that wouldn't be a really fair question to ask. But the flip would be true as well.
I think my assumption would be that this body or these two bodies would determine what the community need is for fire and medical response, and then look at ways to get there. And then the flip side of that is if we don't do that, if we decide what the community needs and can't do that or decide not to do that, what's the harm that's done? And I think much of that harm would be in terms of EMS response and fire response, there would be actual harm to lives and property. But there could also at some point be a decrease in the ISO rating, or I guess increase in the ISO rating, which would go from 1 to a 2. And then people would bear the brunt of that increased property insurance on homes and businesses. So it's not that there's a cost zero way out of it. So just framing, I think the first question is what's needed, and the second question is how to pay for it.
I think from my perspective, I would want to see what the mill levy would look like, what the needed mill levy would look like before making any decision as to whether to do a ballot or not do a ballot. So I would want more detail on that.
I'm pleased to hear the discussion around whether it's city, county, how does that go? Because that I think is confusing to me. And if it's confusing to me as a county commissioner, I'm sure we have plenty of people who live in our community who it's confusing to as well. So I think that's something really, I guess I'd lean against a ballot measure, because I think of how this partnership and relationship works, and that we are a representative body who has to make choices all the time when it comes to mill levy and what's the right mill levy to set, and weighing, as Commissioner Willie said, I thought really well, like what would be the harm? Like if we don't make this change, what's that impact? I'd like to get more information on that to understand. We sort of set this 4-minute benchmark. I'd like to understand, like, if we don't do this, where are we at? It doesn't sound like we're real clear on whether we'll move to ISO 2, like what's the marker that moves to ISO 2? I haven't heard that, and maybe that may be another discussion for another time. But yeah, I just think it's on our elective bodies to work together to think about this issue and how best to first decide whether to do it, and second, how to pay for it.
Real quick, I have a question in regards to option 2. I know it was presented. I'd be curious to know, option 2 was presented to benefit what outcome? Or is there a benefit outcome?
Yeah, option 2 is primarily to address what Chief Llewellyn mentioned earlier, where that station is at the end of its life. And so with that relocation or rebuild, that would be option 2. So addressing the immediate need of facilities versus coverage. And then one thing to also think about with option 2 is so in option 1, station 3 that would have to be rebuilt is moved, and station 7 offsets so that they can provide good coverage throughout all of that area in the north, kind of the northwest and north central space. However, if station 3 is rebuilt at the current location, we come back to the same conversation as option 1 in a few years or less. And if it's moved, then we have new gap areas that are not having great performance.
So essentially, if we went with only an option 2, then we could potentially, we may not even see an improvement in emergency response time. We could create another gap. We're not, I don't see anything listed as far as additional resources. So it's just a physical movement is not going to create any response or responder benefits from what I'm seeing.
That's correct, Commissioner. It would be essentially a rebuild of a single station that would maintain our current service level.
And we would still be struggling with overtime. We'd still be struggling with, so yeah, I'm not seeing it as a viable option for any mutual benefit whatsoever. But it sounds like my fellow commissioners on the city and county level have discussed maybe wanting some additional information around what a ballot measure with a mill levy increase looks like. I know in the presentation, it seems like it was more directed towards the city to lead that charge, but maybe it sounds like there's a potential dual ballot measure or whatnot. And as far as which direction to go, I will leave that. I won't speak for anyone. I think the idea is as we move forward that we want to look at an option 1. All of these are going to impact us as far as it relates to response times as well as the need for FTEs. Unfortunately, this is what happens when I don't think we're at critical mass, but we're at infrastructure and growth in infrastructure, and we're not necessarily looking at this at the 11th hour, but pretty close to it. And how do we move in those spaces as it relates to workforce need, response time need as it relates to ISO, as well as potential need with annexation and growth that we have identified as a measure we would like to address as it relates to prosperity and economic security. So, I have my angst against a ballot measure, especially as we're coming into the budget season and we're looking at revenue neutral or to not and mill, and knowing that others have had previous conversations about wanting to decrease and maybe making those statements prematurely as it relates to the infrastructure needs that we have as it relates to public safety. So I'm not of the right mind to lead even with additional information with the ballot measure. I think this is something that we need to look at from a CIP perspective. We have form of government, we have a presidential election. This could potentially be a nightmare for us with best intentions, with a timeline that we would be giving to educate and inform our constituency on. So, I mean, if we want a perfect storm, yeah, go with a ballot measure and decide between option 1 or option 2. I think it's non sequitur with, regardless if you have a ballot measure. But I think if we're truly committed to wanting to operationalize out this type of expansion and need, then it should be incorporated within the CIP.
So I would just propose, I'm sorry, Sarah, you're going to say something?
I think staff has prepared information on the estimated mill levy impacts.
Oh, they have?
These are very rough. We don't know how pay projections are. There are a lot of things that will impact these. These are a lot of these are estimates, but yes, that's not complicated math.
Yeah, so we do have the estimated mill levy increase for the ongoing annual cost of option 1. So for that $6.8 million annually would be the city of Lawrence is estimated at a 3.32 increase. Douglas County is a 1.285 mill levy increase.
What was the cities?
The city is 3.32 increase.
And that's at the 48 employees. So not next year, it'd be
2025.
at some point when we're fully.
Yeah.
Correct. And so we also, when we budgeted or when we estimated the personnel costs, we looked at to staff a station. So instead of saying new firefighters at this pay rate, we looked at what do we spend annually to staff a station. So with all the ranks, with the certifications, and then those ongoing expenses that those stations incur.
So that's the operational. What about the construction? Pay for that?
For the capital, I know Jeremy's on here. Jeremy, do you have those numbers?
The only numbers I have is what I shared with you last time. I'm still not clear if the city would borrow all the money and then the county would, pay for a portion of our debt service, or if we would have a portion and they would have a portion. I think all those things have varying differences of mill levy impact, but presuming that the city borrowed $52 million, the debt service would be roughly $6.5 to $7 million for the next 30 years. Based on our current assessed valuation, that'd be about an 8.5 per mil increase to the debt service levy.
That's in addition to the 3.32. Wow. Thank you, Jeremy. Any other items want to discuss?
I guess I would just say I'm probably in favor of option 1. I mean, I'd say this. There's no doubt we're going to do it at some point. The only question is when we're going to do it. I mean, you're going to have to build these as we continue to go west and continue to go south. I mean, and I guess I'm in favor of moving that process forward. Certainly building one in the Northwest and relocating 3. I guess the one I continue to have questions on is what do we do about, is it a brand new station, whatever, in south, or is there something we can do by putting, an EMS only along with Fire District 1 to have fire protection, but have EMS there? Is there something we can do, with those facilities, that we could, consider some agreement with them? I don't know enough about it to make a strong statement about it, but I do think there's something we need to look at more with Consolidated 1 and their fire station and how we'd overlap in that area. but maybe the answer is that doesn't work. But I think it's something I'd want to explore before committing fully.
Yeah, this Commissioner Reed and, oh, sorry, go ahead, Commissioner Sellers.
Oh, sorry, Commissioner Reed, just real quick. So to that point, Commissioner Finkeldye, and to Chief Llewellyn, if there was an option, let's just call it 1B, to do one expansion station, a relocation, and to utilize, if we were to utilize those dollars to do one expansion, a relocation, and add additional equipment, do you see that as a viable option? Or is that just, that doesn't do anything?
Was that it for me, Commissioner?
Or for anybody that can answer it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
I see that. I do see that as an option. Obviously, we need to talk to our any affected parties before we moved in, and but I think any option is worth looking at for sure, because there are opportunities that exist here for us to share locations and share services as we discussed. But it'd be anything's worth looking at.
Yeah, I mean, I would say call it a 1B, but maybe that could be the new option 2. I haven't heard anyone clamor about option 2, and I don't want to speak for anyone, but maybe that's another option to look at if you didn't. I mean, I wasn't moved by the rationale for option 2, and so maybe consider that the next go around we have this presentation, if we could see what that would look like.
Yeah,
sorry,
and
Commissioner Reed.
And I can see that when we redo the station optimization analysis, making that area, we can see what the GIS tool is able to do and what those response times look like.
Thank you.
This Commissioner Kelly, I apologize, but I am going to have to leave.
Yeah.
I appreciate the comment. We're a little over our scheduled time, so apologize.
Thank you. Thank you. So if there's nothing else, we can go ahead and adjourn. If nobody,
Mayor, just
you had something
very briefly. I just want to say, I mean, Commissioner Sellers, you practically took the words right out of my mouth, and I just wanted to piggyback off of Commissioner Finkeldye's question to suggest, that there is something is not quite sitting with me about option 1 fully, but I think that's because there's more opportunity there. I think that's really what's sitting with me, that I would agree with Commissioner Sellers that there doesn't seem to be a lot of purpose behind option 2. That feels like a stopgap and a Band-Aid kind of, and it costs a lot of money and doesn't get us a lot of improvement. But option 1 still, it kind of feels like, I don't know, maybe there's just something a little bit more creative, right? A little bit more of a hybrid situation, because I really do appreciate the idea of co-location. And I know that involves a lot of conversations and a lot of entities, but I think there's economies of scale there. I think there's opportunity for like more meaningful and enhanced collaboration countywide. And maybe with state partners even. So I'm interested in going down that road a little bit further and understanding better if there's something besides 2 brand new ground up stations with land acquisition included and the apparatuses and all that and the relocation. If there's something that is a little bit more creative and hybrid, I guess I'll just summarize that.
Thank you.
It's just one small piece we haven't talked about, it's not small piece that we haven't talked about with the conversations about if it comes down to prioritizing neighborhoods over each other, all 3 of those that are identified gaps are actually within my current commission district. So I know those neighborhoods pretty well. And the southern one that's identified are areas of lower socioeconomic status. And I don't want that area in particular to not receive the same upgrade of services as are to the west and to the north. So that's just something to keep as we're looking at creative options or what a 1B might look like, that's part of the conversation too, which I'm sure it would be.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And that's something within the station optimization analysis. One dimension of the 5 dimensions of risks is the disadvantaged population. So we will look at that data again. And then within each of the recommendations that we may produce with this going forward, that information will be a part of that study.
Well, thank you very much, everybody, for your time and the presentation and the questions and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.